Most of the time you're going to be binding to objects in memory that have already been populated. And so the binding can pull the values out of the properties very quickly and push values back into those objects quickly. Occasionally you might bind to something that's a little slower, and that's where async bindings come in. So a binding is calling the get and set block of the property it's bound to, and it does that on the UI thread in a synchronous manner by default. Now, one thing to be aware of is that in WPF, your source objects can raise property change on a separate thread. So you could have a background thread or an async service execution that goes out, gets some data, and pushes values into your data-bound objects. And when you call the set block, the property change event is going to fire. In WPF, that's okay. The binding is actually smart enough to see that you're not on the UI thread, switch to the UI thread, and get the value and update the UI only on the UI thread. However, just be aware, other XAML technologies are not as smart. You cannot do that same thing in other XAML technologies. You'll have to make sure your set blocks are always being called on the UI thread if they raise property change. Now, if the get and set blocks will execute slowly, maybe they make a database call themselves or the service call themselves, you can get the binding to call those on a background thread itself. So all you do is you set isAsync true on the binding, and the binding's actually going to go grab a background thread and use that to dispatch the call to the get or set block. And then once it gets the value, it'll set the target property on the element using the UI thread. Another form of async the binding support is setting a delay on when the binding can call the set block. So this is only for two-way data binding scenarios, and it's basically there to act as a buffer to make sure that you're not sending new values down to the source object too often. The delay property is specified in milliseconds, and it's basically how long will the binding wait before it attempts to set the property on the source object, even if the target property is rapidly changing. So let's take a look at a demo of working with async bindings.